cannot act on itself. It has to be, even if you talk about enterprises, the acts of artificial persons then have to be initiated by human beings that then act as organs of the artificial person. So then if you look at top-level ontologies, you have independent things, such as physical things, and then you have the roles these things play in when they interact with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that a legal person is something that is so a legal person is a relative thing to me and not an independent thing.
Right, that's a very interesting point. We've got, this is our top level lattice. You can see there are 3 layers to it, and some people struggle with this, but as you say, it is a very common way of partitioning the model at the top level. In particular, this top partition here between independent thing, relative thing, and mediating thing. The relative thing is not simply anything that has some kind of relationship with something, but it is anything, the definition of which is that of a thing in a role. So something I haven't shown yet, it wasn't on the slides, is a whole lot of entities defined by their role in business or in society. So when you talk about something as being a non-profit or versus a business, or something that's a special purpose vehicle or a bank or a government agency or something like that, those are all defined as relative things. So the question is it appropriate to apply that thinking to the concept of a legal person? I'm a little reluctant on that, in that legal personhood is conferred on some entity, and it means that that entity has the capacity to be sued at law. But you're quite right that all of the actions and activities of that entity, if it's not a natural person, are carried out by agents on its behalf, and that's something we have not modeled. I would be quite inclined to talk about agents and have a relationship between agent and artificial person called Act 4 or something. Yes, John? Go ahead, John. You have the floor.
No, we haven't done last yet. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, so, Wim, any sort of...
Yeah, if you talk about legal persons, you're always talking about some kind of economic or at least legal context. If you talk about human beings, you're not always talking about an economic or a legal context. So then I think that legal persons, so your color here is different, so I think that already indicates that legal persons are different from human beings.
Right.
Yeah. So that there is at least a different context.
There is. Let me just navigate to where legal person is defined, because these kind of legal personhoods. So we have.
So are you suggesting that that natural person, I mean, a human being and artificial person are sufficient?
Sorry, it depends on the context, of course, but I would like to divide the model in different contexts.
So the question from a philosophical perspective is the concept of legal person only meaningful as something in some role, or is it meaningful in and of itself? I'm inclined to think it's meaningful in and of itself, but that there are agents which act on behalf of some non-human legal person, because both a natural person and a body corporate such as Microsoft or somebody can be sued at law. When you sue them, it's the thing that you sue, and it's the thing which of itself has some instrument of incorporation by which it is constituted under some jurisdiction. So all of
Yeah,
this
but that
says
is
to me,
again in a
this is a thing in itself. This isn't, the definition there isn't a definition which requires the context to define it, I don't believe. I'm open to being persuaded otherwise, but I think
Mike.
the idea of agents is a separate idea, and we can build up a whole hierarchy of agents acting on behalf of non-natural legal persons. I think that's a separate question.
Mike, I've got a comment from Jacob. Jacobus
Yep.
Gillock. Can you
Yep.
Can you speak, Jacob? Yes.
Oh.
Hello.
Yes, I can. Yeah. I am at a conference at the moment, but I just wanted to say that classes can overlap. So one individual, like a child, for example, could be a human being and a legal person at the same time. So I don't see the issue really to see a legal person as a role of a human being. I think Mike is right that it's just the same. It can be the same thing. You can have one thing, one individual with multiple types.
Right. Thank you, Jacobus. That
Yep.
certainly makes sense of how I see it. I think to define a relative thing, and we've had to do some very careful thinking on all of our relative things usage, and it's a difficult concept. But it's a thing, the definition of which is dependent on the context. So, for example, to talk about a pilot, a person fulfills the role of a pilot in the context of aviation, and that same person may fulfill the role of a mother, an employee, and so on. So that definition requires that it has a context, and that in that context, that individual fulfills that role. I don't see that being the case for legal person.
Exactly.
It's anything which is defined as something which is capable of liability. And that fact about legal person remains the case, whatever context that legal person may be acting in. Perhaps let me show you some of those context ones, and we haven't shown these before. These are, and I think this is quite an important part of the model I want to come on to another time, what we call a functional business entity. These are all in the relative things hierarchy. So to be a business, to be an international agency, to be a non-profit, and so on. The things which can be that thing in that role, some of them may be any kind of autonomous entity. So a business, for example, can be a sole trader, or it can be a body corporate, or whatever. Similarly, international agencies may or may not have legal personhood. Non-profits generally have to have some kind of form as possibly an artificial person. We'll have to validate that. But these are all things defined in their roles. There's also a lot of fund entities. We put some example ones here, and things like government mortgage agencies and so on, which are government bodies, which are some entity in some role, and that role doesn't really define what kind of entity it is. So we didn't put those in the hierarchy of independent things. We thought a lot about this because you could quite legitimately create another set of subclasses which are non-overlapping, which do this, but we felt that because of the nature of the role and context of these, it was appropriate to make these relative entities. But as Jacobus says, the legal person in itself can stand in some role. It can be a business, or it can be a government agency, or it can be an international agency, or whatever, or a regulator, government mortgage agency, and so on. So that says to me, this is more appropriate to have as an autonomous entity. So can we get any finalization on this, or can we take a straw poll of what people think? Because I know not everybody cares that strongly about this relative entity concept, but it is one that we use a lot, and we want to get it right.
Mike, can I just ask a question here? It's David Winter.
Yes, David.
Why use person? Why not use legal entity? Because then that covers all human and corporate structures. Because legal person and therefore, as a consequence, artificial person are very uncomfortable, unnatural terms. And that's why I think a lot of people find some difficulty with them. So why not legal entity? I know you sort of use it in other parts of the model, but it just seems a much more appropriate term to cover entities that have a legal existence.
Right. There's really two separate conversations here. One is what is the nature of the things that we're interested in, and another is what are the best labels for each of those. And the question I started this part of the conversation with is, can we come up with a better label than artificial person, such as, for example, body corporate? Now, separate from that, legal entity, and this is what I really want to get some consensus on. It was clear that, for example, the LEI, legal entity identifier, wants to identify things like trusts and partnerships, which may or may not be incorporated as legal persons under some formal instrument of incorporation, that being what defines this artificial person or body corporate. You know what, I didn't hear any objections, so I'm going to rename this body corporate. Does anybody have a problem with that name? Because that was the question I started off with and wanted to get an answer to. Does that have some other legal implications that would make this wrong, or is this a better label for some entity which is capable of liability and which is not a natural person? Is this the best label for that? Because I don't think artificial person was the best label.
Right, Mike, can I just stop you there then? Philip Lee, you have your hand raised, and also I had comments from Brian Stein. So, Philip Lee, your line is released.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just wanted to completely agree with the previous speaker regarding the use of the term legal entity. I think that's exactly right. A legal entity is a person or a corporate body, and also covers all of the different types of funds that we're going to be dealing with, no doubt, in a few minutes.
Good, thank you. Yes,
Okay.
I'll come back to that as soon as I finish answering the question I wanted to start with. So does somebody have any pro or for or against for renaming artificial person to body corporate?
Hi, this is Brian. I had a comment separate from...
Mike, you can't switch the conversation. Just hold that body corporate question for later. Right now, we got to deal with legal entity versus legal person. I believe people have opinions about that.
Okay. I just wanted to get the easy one out of the way first. Okay, so we defined legal entity as anything which has signatory capacity. Again, the labels are up for negotiation, like all of these labels are. And I think the previous comment was absolutely what we're trying to get to, which is for LEI purposes, we're interested in things other than legal persons which have the capacity to sign some contract or enter into some contractual arrangement, regardless of whether they are some legal person that is constituted by some instrument of incorporation. And so we created that as a separate concept. One of the suggestions we had...
Hang on, Mike, stop right there.
Mm-hmm.
So you got your fundamental point. Let's make sure there's either agreement or disagreement that the nature of signatory capacity necessitates a separate label called legal entity.
Right.
Yes. I agree.
Thanks, John.
Does anybody disagree? You want to raise a point, because it sounds like that was the core question, or a core question.
Well, signatory capacity suggests to me that it's a contractual thing rather than the body that is associated with that contract.
Correct.
But we do need to make a distinction, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm.
So only a legal entity can do it.
Yes, go on.
So if you're not speaking, please go on mute to avoid background noise. Please continue. Perfect.
The only people who can sign contracts are real human beings, and they do so on behalf of another legal entity.
Oh.
Otherwise, that signatory has no legal context whatsoever.
Right. That's a very
or they can do it on the basis of an individual signing a contract with a corporate.
Yeah, but the individual is a legal entity, and they are signing on behalf of another legal entity because they've been designated signatory authority.
Good.
And that's incorporated in the normal human being context. Yeah.
Yep.
That's why legal entity is such a powerful concept.
Marina, you've got a question
so
as
they basically
well?
have some capacity designated to them.
Yes, I had question about definition of legal person. Is it take into consideration the definition of U.S. person and as defined in extraterritorial legislation in latest CFTC proposed swap rules of the Dodd-Frank Act? Because kind of definitions are pretty different in this legislation and sex regulation fee and Volcker rule.
That's a very good
If
point.
we compare all definitions, then it might have impact on how we define legal person.
Right, thank you. Oops. Yeah, that's. Can anybody tell us a little bit about what that U.S. definition of extraterritoriality implies? Because I'd like to get to the bottom of that.
Hey, Mike, this is John. I think you're going down a rabbit hole with this. What I think you just want to define a legal person or legal entity as someone is defined as a legal entity or legal person according to the laws of the country that they're doing business in. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to get all these strange situations. You know, let it be just up to that particular domicile. You know, as I sent in my email to you yesterday, I thought of another situation. You know, my son is 21, so in the U.S. He can enter into a contract. He's a legal person, but if he wants to do business, let's say in Switzerland, and maybe there the age of is 25. So although he's a legal person in the U.S., he can't go into contracts in Switzerland because he's not 25 yet. So you get all these strange situations. So I think you just want to say, the legal person is according to the laws of the area in which they are doing business.
Right. So for human beings, we've captured that in the definition, but perhaps we can do more with it. We've got that it's a person of maturity who, in the eyes of the law, is able to assume obligations. That is to say, a human being beyond the age of majority in the relevant jurisdiction, and therefore deemed capable of legal action and being sued at law. So we've tried to frame the definition in such a way that whatever jurisdiction you're in, that definition remains true, even though the age of majority may differ from one jurisdiction to another. Perhaps what we haven't got is a relationship between this and the jurisdiction, which would give us a bit of formality on that. That's certainly worth thinking. But then to the point about legal entity versus legal person, I think legal personhood is pretty well defined globally as being something that can accrue liability. Let me explain what we were getting at with legal entity, because perhaps this capacity is the wrong one. I quite like this idea of agency. What we wanted was, I was talking to some legal folks, and they were saying that we'd tried in the past to essentially make legal person and legal entity synonymous, because the legal person is who is ultimately liable for something. But if, for example, a non-incorporated entity such as a partnership enters into a contract, it can enter into that contract. The liability unwinds to the partners who are jointly and severally liable. But the first point you go to get redress, if there's some default by that entity, is the partnership. That's the legal entity. That's where we want the legal entity identifier to apply, even if the liability then unwinds through some internal signatures to the various legal persons who are the partners in that partnership. So perhaps legal signatory capacity is the wrong name for this capacity, but this is the distinction we're trying to draw at this point in time. I've had a comment there. Go ahead.
No, what you said was absolutely correct. Yeah, the legal entity and the partners of the legal entity are all legal entities.
Yep. Okay, so perhaps signatory capacity, I'm inclined to agree, is the wrong label for what it is that makes something a legal entity, because that's actually the capacity of some agent. And here we bring in Wim's ideas about modeling more explicitly the agents that act on behalf of some entity. But the scope of what we're calling legal entity is any of those things that may or may not be a legal person, maybe a partnership, a trust, and so on. I wanted to inject one other comment from last week, which is relevant to what we're talking about now, which is whether one or other of these should be subtypes of each other. We separated them completely in terms of the two different capacities that define these kinds of things. But in reality, any legal person will also be something that can enter into a contract. So perhaps they should be, in some kind of superclass subclass relationship. Does anybody feel strongly either way about that, or is that something we want to come back to later and first get to the bottom of this capacity?
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite hear it.
Sure. So one comment from last time was whether, in fact, these shouldn't be parallel to each other. You've got legal person here and legal entity here, but should legal person be a subclass of legal entity, given that any legal person not only has liability accruing to it, but it also clearly can enter into contracts anyway? Or would that complicate the hierarchy?
Mike.
Well, that's
Sorry.
That's certainly the way I've modelled the last 25 years.
Right.
Yeah, I agree too. Yeah.
I've got a comment. Kieran McCown, can you be heard? Kieran? No, I've got a message from Kieran. It's quite a lengthy one, but I'll read it out. The problem with term legal person, it is often used as an English translation of the Latin persona ficta, excluding natural persons. A legal person, also an artificial person, juridical person, juristic person, and body corporate, also commonly called a vehicle, has a legal name and has rights, protections, privileges, responsibilities, and liabilities under law, just as a natural person do. The concept of a legal person is a fundamental legal fiction. It is pertinent to the philosophy of law, as it is essential to laws affecting a corporation, which is corporations law, the law of business associations. Is that clear?
It is. And it would make a reason not to create this superclass, subclass hierarchy that I've just created, because if the model also includes natural persons, which it does, if legal entities are meant to not include natural persons, then we can't rearrange the hierarchy in this way. So I think you've got a very important point there, which is that you have in law, so up to the 16th century, human beings were the only legal persons, and then in every jurisdiction you have some kind of natural fiction which allows for the creation of legal entities which can be sued in their own right and can own property in their own right and so on, which are not natural persons. Those are always constituted under some statute by some instrument of incorporation that's described in that statute, and that's the nature of this natural fiction which causes this thing to exist. So any comments on that?
Well, sorry, I must have missed Mike. It's Phil Lee here. I must have misunderstood, because when I saw you typing on the screen, you typed the exact opposite of what I was expecting you to type.
Oh.
Which is that certainly the way that I've always modelled this since time began. Legal entity is the fundamental thing, and that breaks down into corporate entities, which are kind of what you've been calling body corporate. Yeah,
right.
People, sovereign government, and fund vehicles. And those are the fundamental types of legal entity. All of those can enter into contracts, can accrue liability, etc., be sued in a court of law, etc., etc.
So if they can all enter into contract and be sued at law, then they're all what we're calling legal person and not what we're giving the label legal entity to. But I would imagine that there are not enough words to go around. The labels are never going to line up with every data model, but have we got the concept right?
The conclusion to that is that legal person and legal entity are kind of synonymous concepts.
Yes, we originally had them as synonymous concepts, but there are things which you can initially sue, but they are not the things which carry the liability. For example, partnerships. I think we got.
But that's a highly niche and moot point. Partnerships are still legal entities.
Right, but they're not legal persons.
But that's a tiny point of law, that varies from one jurisdiction to the next. In some countries, partnerships can be sued, even partnerships not incorporated by shares or limited by guarantee.
Ah, that is interesting. Thank you.
Mike, also another note which has come through via email from Mike Damas, who's been sending a few points on this. What he's saying is that they've been designed as signatory capacity, not because they're legal entities themselves, but rather because the artificial entity, the corporation, requires human beings in order to operate.
Thank you. And that reinforces the earlier point somebody made, that signatory capacity is a valuable concept, but it's the wrong one for what we're trying to describe against legal entity. Legal entity is something you something can enter into a contract and you initially go to for redress. A legal person is what that liability ultimately unwinds to, the thing which is capable of carrying that liability. Signatory capacity is a better description of what the agent does on behalf of the entity. Have I understood you right in saying that, and linking it to what somebody said previously?
Mike, I think you're ignoring the fundamental question that I'd like to get resolved. So I heard the suggestion that legal entity divides up into the four that you've listed there: corporate entities, people, sovereigns, and fund vehicles. Yep. And then you're saying we should model a specific point of law, kind of an exception in your core model. So we got to resolve, should you or shouldn't you? Right. So if you want to make the case of why the exception needs to be modeled, please do that, because that's how we're going to get the fundamentals agreed to.
Okay. I think if we start with legal entity as being the most general thing, and if we include people under that, it does make sense of these suggestions that several people agreed with, that these should be in a superclass, subclass hierarchy. Now, to Kieran's point, some folks would use the label legal entity to refer to something which is explicitly not a natural person. That's clearly not the case in this list here. If we stick to the definition that corresponds to this list here, I have some further thoughts on fund vehicles, but we'll leave that for now. Then this superclass, subclass thing works. So, Kieran, I'd like your comments on that, please. You there, Kieran?
Hey, Mike.
No, I was going on mute. Go ahead, John.
Yeah. I'm looking at this. I'm really getting into what Mike Atkins is saying. We really need somewhere in this the concept of a regulatory authority, because what happens is, as Mike was alluding to, was that we can put this stuff down, but as was pointed out, the U.S. has some differences. Some countries don't do partnerships, so you get down to, well, here's generic things, but then it's really up to the regulatory authority of the particular area to have all these exceptions. As I brought up to Mike yesterday, in Saudi Arabia, women are not legal entities. So it's, you get all these strange things out there. So we really have to somehow get the regulatory authority involved in this diagram.
Excellent, thank you.
Mike, can I say something about that? I think we should split that up into multiple ontologies, where we have an upper ontology, a legal ontology describing the basic legal concepts that we can just derive from law or international law. It should be as generic as possible, and then have lower level ontologies where you can work out things like fund vehicles or regulatory the regulators, etc. Because we should not pollute the higher level ontologies with those details.
Right, I agree, but I hope that in the higher level ontology we can define the most general kinds of things. And as we saw with human beings and their age of majority, I think the same things will apply with legal personhood for non-human entities, is that if we capture the basic nature of these things as generally and as vaguely as we can, then one can extend that for different jurisdictions by specializing these very general concepts.
So Mike, I hear agreement so far on these two ideas of the four components of legal entity, and the last comment that legal concepts should be as generic as possible, and then exceptions should be dealt with separately.
Yeah.
So is this something that you fundamentally have a problem with, Mike, or does this make sense to you in the way that you view the ontology structure?
It makes sense to me. I can even add more details like the relationship to the jurisdiction, which would formalize at least the basic concepts of that. I think this is right. Yeah, I was getting back to Kieran on I think interpretation of a different label of legal entity and just making sure everybody's happy. But I like this idea that the legal entity is the most general thing. It includes people in its scope, and therefore everything comes down from that. Makes the model much simpler. It means that we can specialize and specialize for different kinds of thing in a single hierarchy. I do think that this signatory capacity is the wrong label for what it means to be a legal entity at that level. So we need to.
Okay, so let's take these one at a time, and make sure that there is no concern out there about the most general concept being legal entity divided up into the four components as illustrated. Does anybody have a concern about that? Cheryl, go ahead.
Leora, your line has been released. Do you have a concern?
Yes, thank you. I've been trying actually to do this for a long time. I couldn't find the raise hand icon. It took me half an hour to find it. So I brought up this point last week. The point is that when you're doing this ontology, you also have to take into account groups, and you don't really take into account groups over here. So you have this notion of a person and entity. I happen to agree that an entity really needs to be the fundamental top level concept. I agree with those who argue that. But you also need to have the concept of grouping things together, because otherwise you're going to find many things hard to say. Sometimes you have something like a corporation or something of the kind which happens to have a bunch of members. But in general, the notion of a group is important, because there are many situations when you're talking about two or more parties involved in a particular action. And unless you put that explicitly into your ontology, the notion of a group, you're not really going to be able to do that. And I don't really see that. So,
thank you. That's a very good point.
While he's writing that out, Michael, I thought I did see the concept of grouping and subsidiaries and components in the model.
Yes.
Yes, you have the notion of has a member. But you have the notion of has a member, so you can have, but you don't have the notion of an entity that is formed by various groups. So you want to be able to talk about the fact, let's say you have some allies, right? So you have.
Oh, okay. You mean partnerships as a group, like partnerships.
Yes,
not a group like a component. Okay. Right.
Well, yes. I mean partnerships, but it doesn't necessarily need to be formal in that sense. There will be times when you want to say things even when they're not formal, and I think it's important to make that distinction. It's not necessarily straightforward to do it in ontology. I mean, ontologies don't really lend themselves to that way. You have to add a little bit of structure to it, but it is important to do.
Thank you, Leora.
So it's not just partnership.
Totally agree. Partnership is a very special case of that. There are lots of other more common cases.
Exactly.
Yeah, such as joint ventures, for example.
Yep.
Exactly. Yes. Right.
So you need the concept of a compound entity, which is a junction of any of the other sorts of entities that you've got.
Excellent.
Right. You have to have some method of grouping. Yes.
Yeah, be it people or organization or corporate entities, whatever, coming together to create a compound thing
Exactly.
Right.
You need that compound, and it can be, for example, two people and three organizations that come together in some way. There can be all sorts of things. But yes, that's exactly right.
So it sounds to me like those are lower level ontology structures that would still fit with your 4 basic groupings. Did I misinterpret that?
Can I have a go at responding to Leora's point, because I think it's a very important point, and yes, Mike, it does fit, but it fits in a slightly different way.
Yeah, go ahead. Don't worry, go ahead.
As well as having, in our multiple hierarchy of parallel kinds of thing, an incorporated company, as well as being a legal person or a legal entity or both, is also a kind of formal organization. And we have the concept of an organization, which is something that has members. And for formal organization, we added the concept that a formal organization is something which has some formal contractual agreement among the principals, and an informal organization is anything else. Now, from Leora's point, I think there's more that we haven't modeled that is so high level and fundamental that we should. And that is the difference between an organization, which by definition has some kind of structure to it, and a group which does not. And so as well as organizations, formal organizations with some covering agreement, informal organizations without, for money laundering purposes and so on, we also have other kinds of grouping. I would very much like to add that to the model. I would see it as being, from our ontology fundamentals, we'd use the whole part type of relationships to talk about a set or a grouping of entities. And now that we've simplified the hierarchy of legal entities, we can simply talk about something which is a group of legal entities, and by definition that could be a group of people, a group of corporations, or a group of anything else. So there's a membership relationship between the group and the entity, just as there is between an organization and the entities that can be part of that organization. So that is a really good catch, a really good addition to the model. I am completely happy with it. Is anybody else less happy with any of that?
Sounds like you got a sale on that one, Mike.
Yep.
Fantastic. Good. So I'll add that. I've made a note to add that. So in the organization section, we have things like, we've got formal organization. They have subunits. This is where we start to talk about trading desks and branches and divisions and so on. And all of that relates to a formal organization, but we have groups of entities as well. Joint venture, in our relationship hierarchies, we define some relationships for joint venture, but to actually define the joint venture as a group of entities would be an excellent addition to the model. Good. Good. I'm completely happy with that. I hope everybody else is too. So that gives me 2 significant changes to make to the model, one of which I already made. Find what diagram we were on. Good. So then, where do we want to go from here? We've simplified the whole relationship hierarchy. Obviously, diagrams can be rearranged.
Mike, tell me if there are any implications that you need to address in remodeling and refactoring the ontology based on the 2 decisions you made. And if there are, perhaps it's best to set up the next thing that you think is the objective for people to think about.
Right. I'm just looking at a diagram here which has most of these things on it, and we can show the implication of the change we just made. If I add group to that, then it covers all of the basic fundamentals that we've talked about. I will regenerate the diagrams and send them around so that we can review and validate those offline, so that by our next session we're ready to dive into some of the facts which apply to things. And for example, some of the facts that we asserted about incorporated companies seem to be duplicates of facts that are true of any body corporate. And so there's some simplification to do on the facts models, which I propose that we look at next time. And then I can redo the diagrams as I've just redone this one.
All right, so you're going to refactor the ontology to get validation between now and next week on legal entity and on organization, right?
Yep.
And then the specific thing that people should be looking at now is the facts about incorporated companies versus body corporate. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, I think so. And I think what else we could...
Going to need to start thinking about fund vehicles at some point, because they're the most complicated.
They certainly are. Now, I have a question about fund vehicles, a scoping question. So when we tried to finalize the earlier draft of this and we stumbled upon the complexity of fund vehicles, we went, oh, let's leave it out of scope this time and talk about it in a future version. But they are very important. I think perhaps we should think about those now, but I'd like people's view on, because I'll show you what we're doing with fund vehicles, because
before you move on to what we're doing, the fundamental question of do we need to include fund vehicles in the first release is a critical question, right? Because if you're trying to align this with an LEI use case, we have to make sure it's relevant. Go ahead, John.
Given that at least 30% of any major investment transaction profile involves dealing with fund vehicles, surely the answer's got to be yes.
Okay.
Well, I would think so, but I heard that question. I want to make sure that we're in agreement.
Okay.
Fantastic.
So does anybody disagree with that? And Mike, maybe you can take us through your current travail and status on funds for people to think about.
Sure. Okay, so the way we looked at fund vehicles, and we put a few example ones in just for illustration from France. These are SICAVs, SICAFs, and FCPs. And of course, there are other ones for every jurisdiction that there is. And this is when we realized that, well, rather than simply iterating hundreds of kinds of entity, these are really entities in some role. So some kinds of funds can be a trust. For example, a trust fund, the name gives it away there. Some kinds of funds must be some body corporate. Obviously, they can't be an individual person, but they must be a legal entity. Different jurisdictions have different arrangements for what kinds of bodies different funds can be. So that fits very much into this concept of the functional business entity. This is the relative thing that is some entity in some role, in this case, some role in relation to its business function at the fund. The same kind of thing applies to government bodies like government mortgage agencies and so on. They are something which has a relationship saying what kind of entity must it be, but what it is by its function is a fund. So that's where we're going with that. Now with trusts, again, trusts were something that we thought was perhaps too complex to include, but I think with the kind of expertise we have on the line now, we can go back to it. We did only the very basics about trusts. So a trust is a kind of formal organization. It's a legal entity, but not necessarily a legal person. Now, I gather in some jurisdictions they are a legal person, so we have some jurisdictional varieties there. The trust has a formal trust agreement which sets out particular roles like beneficiary and trustee and so on, and sponsoring party. And these little thick men are also, these are agents essentially, or parties in some role, relative things again. This is very basic and doesn't distinguish between different kinds of trusts and doesn't link to the roles the trusts can fulfill. Now, of course, funds are not the only roles that trusts can fulfill, but it's an important one. So this is what we have at the moment.
So Mike, there's a couple of things. If we are going to dive into funds and trusts next time, can you point people to where this is in a model, or is it difficult for them to find, so that we can have them come prepared for that conversation? And then specifically, what's your request? Is it really now a conceptual structure about funds that you want to get agreement on, or is there something else?
Right. Good. Yes, I think I can show you how far we got, and hopefully it should be clear from what's missing, what we still need to figure out. So there's two things.
Because you only have 8 minutes before you lose people, so make sure we got clarity on next time.
Right. Okay. So for those of you that are able to download the model, and I'll do a diagram of the model structure as well so that you can find it, we have FIBO-BE, this is the business entities component, and this has within it sections like business entity, corporation, partnership, and trust. So this trust model is right here. Separately from that, and much more in draft at the moment, under financial industry model, we have the financial instruments taxonomy. This is where debt and equity and so on live. And under here we have CIV. This is collective investment vehicles. Now we started with some work from Working Group 5, which had a lot of input from IFAMA. Then I went over to Rotterdam and spent a couple of very intensive days working with the IFAMA folks on their model for collective investment vehicles. It is very complex. It covers the fund itself as some kind of pool of assets. It covers types of funds. It covers portfolios and holdings and so on. And it has certain relationships to kinds of entities somewhere in here. So there's a lot of work needs doing on funds itself. But if we can get the fund-related entities right, then I would suggest that we can do funds themselves as a future release, because the IFAMA data dictionary has been updated since I first created this. So we have some common concepts around funds. You've got investment strategies, objectives, all sorts of stuff. We did a lot of work on it. And somewhere in here are firstly the entity which the fund can be, but also entities like the fund manager, which is a service provider to the fund, and which should probably be one of those relative entities again, because it is a thing in a role. I can't see it on this diagram.
Fund manager's legal entity.
Exactly, and it has to be a legal entity, doesn't it? So it's an entity in a role because it's the fund manager, but to be a fund manager, you have to be some kind of legal entity. So there's the relationship between the relative thing, as Vim was describing, and the independent thing, which it must be, which is that it must be some kind of legal entity. It need not be a particular kind of legal entity, but it must be some kind of legal entity, or perhaps even some kind of legal person. And those are the kinds of distinctions we want to draw out.
Okay, so Mike, before we only got 5 minutes.
Yep.
So two things. Is this only available if they download the model, or is it available online?
It's available online as well. Let me find the.
All right, so we will send out links to get you to it, so that they can look for now. Now, it seems to me that is it possible for you to craft the thematic areas associated with funds that we need to get answers to before next meeting?
Absolutely, yes. And I will
if you will do that and get it out to people, they can come prepared with those issues. If I heard correctly, we need to validate the upper legal entity structure, but it sounds like pretty close. But this will include labels, validate the organization, including the concept of grouping, and the facts about organizations, and then the thematic structure of funds. Is that correct, Mike?
Yes. So I will update the main core diagrams with the changes we talked about. I can also add some of that agency stuff, but I won't let that hold it up. I will find the most useful diagrams on funds, and in fact, looking at the web, I've gone straight to a much more useful diagram on the web than I was able to find in the tools. So that's the one I will circulate.
Well, you'll spend time finding what we need to get people aligned. In the meantime, anybody who wants to plant some ideas in your mind are invited to do so directly. We would encourage you to do that. So let's come prepared next time for the thematic structure of funds.
Fantastic.
And can I
just to let you know, I've taken all your comments.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, it was a comment, and then Mike, you can conclude.
Sorry, that was just Carol. Just to say that whatever you produce, Mike, I will make sure, so everyone's aware, that on the home page, on the latest news, I will add the links there so that everybody can find it very easily.
Fantastic.
Good. Mike, go ahead and conclude.
Yeah, so just to let you know, all the comments you sent in to me by email, I haven't responded to most of you directly. I've been putting all of those in a spreadsheet with numbers on them and everything, so that every issue that's been raised, I'll do the same for this week's comments, both in the Thingamy and by email subsequently. So all of that is not lost, and that's really what's feeding into subsequent conversations.
Okay, so Mike, the final question to think about and raise this next time is, given our hoped time frame,
yep,
do we need to go to 90 minutes, and is that feasible?
I would like to go to 90 minutes if people can
So
stand
put
it.
that in the note going out, and we'll get either booze or agreements, and we can then schedule for 90 minutes, because we're trying to meet our next cycle if possible.
Yep.
If not possible, we will delay the release of the standard.
Right, and particularly as we have consensus that funds which we try to kick into the long grass is in fact important and must be done and got right now.
Thank you all for coming. Once again, go lobby Mike directly on all of this, including funds. Mike, you're going to send out links, and you're going to craft the ontology with what you learned today. Correct?
Correct. Absolutely. Yep. I will do that